2023, and I'm honored to have with me John Ziegler, who has spent a good fraction of a number of years investigating the Joe Paterno Penn State issue revolved around Jerry Sandusky. John, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came upon this.
Well, Randy, I've been in virtually every aspect of the news media for about 35 years now in my career after graduating from Georgetown University. And I started in sports and television sports and went into talk radio and did documentary films. And when this story broke in November of 2011, I was a conservative documentarian of some note. My previous film had debuted on the Today Show in a rather contentious interview in the prime slot with Matt Lauer. And I was looking for my next project. And all of a sudden, out of State College, Pennsylvania, explodes this extraordinary story where we're told by the news media that Jerry Sandusky, a longtime former Penn State assistant football coach, was being accused and charged with multiple counts of child molestation, and that Penn State as an institution, and specifically Joe Paterno, the legendary head football coach at Penn State, had enabled this activity and covered it up, and that this was all the biggest scandal in the modern history of college football, and that everything that we thought we knew about Penn State was a complete fraud. And having grown up in the suburbs of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, I was very familiar with Joe Paterno and Penn State. I was not a Penn State fan. In fact, I grew up as a Notre Dame fan. But I had experience in sports. I had experience in football. I had coached high school football in two different states over a very different period of time. I'd written a book about a high school football team in Ohio. I'd covered college and pro football for television. So I was very familiar with Penn State and with the culture of football in general, and the story never made any sense to me, at least as we were being told it back in November of 2011. So I started to investigate it with the intent of doing a documentary film to see whether or not my instincts that Joe Paterno, the head football coach, was being railroaded here, that the media was rushing to judgment, and that this firestorm that occurred that erupted, and in 3 days, but these 3 or 4 days, basically went from nothing to resulting in the firing of the winningest coach in the history of college football just a couple of days before his final home game at Penn State, that there was an injustice being done here. And I never imagined that I'd still be talking about this almost 12 years later, because I have spent much, if not most, of the last 12 years investigating the case. And I began it with the suspicion that Joe Paterno was innocent and being railroaded. And long ago, I came to the conclusion that it turns out that everybody in this case who was accused was not just innocent, but clearly innocent, including, believe it or not, Jerry Sandusky, who I had assumed at the beginning had to be at least mostly guilty of the things that he was being accused of. But now I know that everybody was innocent, and the most remarkable part of the whole story is that it's not even close. It's not remotely close, and we've done a podcast, an epic podcast, which documents the entire story from a completely different perspective than you've ever heard before, called With the Benefit of Hindsight, that I believe proves beyond any reasonable doubt at all that everybody, including Jerry Sandusky, as stunning as it sounds, was completely and totally innocent. And there was no child molestation in this entire scandal. And that the reason why this happened is because the news media is completely and totally and fundamentally broken. And once they get a narrative that they like and they latch onto and become invested in, it's absolutely impossible, especially under these particular circumstances, to get them to reverse what they have perpetrated. And unfortunately, I think that this is an injustice that's going to fall through the cracks of history and never be corrected because of some unique circumstances, but also because of the world in which we now live, where I think this kind of thing can happen fairly easily.
You know, Jerry Sandusky ultimately did have his day in court, and he was found guilty. What's up with that? Can you tell us why you think you have better evidence than his own attorneys did at the time?
Well, again, I urge you to take a listen to the podcast with the benefit of hindsight because it's voluminous. But there was something that you referenced earlier about good guys and bad guys. And I think that is the key to what happened here, that the media thought that they had seen this movie before. And they had seen this movie before when it came to the Catholic Church scandal. Mm-hmm. And so when you take a look at the characters in this passion play, it was very easy for the media. The media thought this was as open and shut as it gets. Oh, okay, this is just like the Catholic Church. Paterno is the Pope. The Penn State administrators are the cardinals covering this all up. Jerry Sandusky is the pedophile priest. And the Penn State football fans are the Catholic parishioners looking the other way to protect their sacred institution. This all fit. The casting was perfect. I mean, heck, Paterno was even a Catholic, Italian Catholic. So this is all very understandable in the media's mind. And so therefore, the good guys and the bad guys of the story were instantaneously known. The white hats and the black hats fit perfectly in the media's minds. And anybody who was on the victim side was automatically a white hat and had to be protected at all costs. Everybody on the other side, the black hat side, needed to be destroyed immediately and brought to full justice, because obviously the allegations here are horrendous. They blow people's minds, especially heterosexual males who just do not understandably like to talk about this kind of subject where you have male on male child sex abuse. And so the details never get talked about. There's a horrendous allegation that gets an enormous amount of media coverage, which most people probably don't even remember at this time. But the centerpiece of this whole thing was this allegation that a former Penn State assistant coach by the name of Mike McQueary had witnessed Jerry Sandusky in a Penn State shower raping a boy. And that the investigation of that episode is really the heart of the whole case, because if you don't have the McQueary episode, everything else falls apart. If people understood just how incredibly weak the rest of the case is against Sandusky, it's almost it is at times laughable. I mean, there are times in our podcast with the benefit of hindsight that are truly funny if they weren't so tragic. So the heart of the entire case is Mike McQueary's allegation. And in our first episode of With the Benefit of Hindsight, we destroy the entire McQueary allegation, and we destroy it in a way that the defense never even, I believe they should have known and figured this out, but they never had the time, the inclination, the resources, or the imagination to figure out the key to why the Mike McQueary story is completely false. And that is, it has very little to do with what the kid in the shower said, which is extraordinary, or how inconsistent his own statements were, which are extraordinarily inconsistent and contradictory. To me, this is all about dates. And that's why we call the first episode of With the Benefit of Hindsight podcast The Date. Because when you look at the dates that have been alleged where this occurred, any rational person will go, wait a minute. Not only did this not happen the way that the prosecution claimed that it did, there's no way it happened anything close to that. And I'm happy to get into that if you'd like, but the bottom line is the prosecution had to admit that they got the date in the original presentment not wrong by a little bit. They got the date, the month, and the year totally wrong. And I believe, and this is where the defense really screwed up, I believe that the second date, I believe strongly that the second date that the prosecution ended up using at trial, there was one date for the presentment when the charges went down, and there was a second date that they go, oops, sorry, we found emails, we realized we were off by 13 months. And that's the date they used at trial. Well, even the date they used at trial, I strongly believe is totally wrong. And it's wrong in a way that completely changes the narrative and makes it impossible for Mike McQueary's story to be true. And instead, I believe Mike McQueary's story was reverse engineered by a prosecution that was desperate after 2 years of getting nowhere in an investigation. And the reason why they were getting nowhere in an investigation was because there was no evidence. And the reason there was no evidence is because Jerry Sandusky wasn't a child abuser. He was a weird dude with boundary issues who was goofy and made a lot of stupid decisions, like, for instance, showering with boys he considered to be his son, but he never did anything that was remotely illegal, never had any ill intent, and he was incredibly vulnerable to this kind of a firestorm because he was very, very, very naive and did not realize the trouble he was in until it was way too late. And then when you have a defense that is completely overwhelmed, has no resources, the judge provides not one continuance. This trial occurs less than 7 months after arrest, a time period of massive media coverage where Joe Paterno dies 2 months after he gets fired over the Jerry Sandusky allegations, meaning that the most heroic figure in this community, Joe Paterno, effectively got killed by the actions of Jerry Sandusky. So Jerry Sandusky in that community is seen not just as a child molester, he's the child molester that killed Santa Claus. And you have a unique element of this allegation where the community itself is being accused of enabling the crimes. So the incentive of the jury is to tell the rest of the world, we here in State College, Pennsylvania, we so hate child molestation, we're going to railroad our own guy with no evidence to show everybody that we aren't really in favor of child molestation. So effectively what happens is this trial, in all seriousness, Randy, this trial was right up there with the Salem witch trials. I mean, it was that bad.
Here's some elements relevant of Salem. And I think there are a lot of things that happen in our news that are similar to that. One day we're supposed to believe all women. I think, the Brett Kavanaugh, whatever you want to call it, hearings, I guess, in Congress were very Salem witchy-ish, whatever the adjective would be. Where not just Christine Blasey Ford, but there were all kinds of accusers popping up from everywhere. Didn't remember him, didn't go, they couldn't identify him at the time. Nobody said anything, and so forth. But in the Sandusky case, there are some elements that I'd like, maybe, obviously you're expert on this, to go over with you. I mean, what happened in 1998 where supposedly Paterno heard something about Sandusky? Was there an actionable item at that point? What was it he heard and should have been more acutely aware of regarding Sandusky, so that 12 years later Sandusky wouldn't have been in the position that he was in, you say, naively and so forth. It seems to me like there was some attention 12 years prior. A. B. What cui bono? What benefit did Mike McQueary get from his statement, and what did he hear, and what did he witness? I gather from reading your work that he did not actually witness any kind of sexual encounter. There was some kind of auditory thing that he made note of. He didn't bring it up with Sandusky, I gather. Anyway, set us a little bit of the timeline. What happened earlier on? How did things go on? And what, if anything, was Joe Paterno guilty of by association?
Okay, wow. Okay, to answer your question in detail would take about 3 hours, but I'm going to try to narrow it down as succinctly as I possibly can. So, the first allegation ever brought against Jerry Sandusky occurs in 1998 when Jerry Sandusky lifts up a young boy in a Penn State shower with lots of other people around. These are effectively semi-public showers, okay? I think many people have a misunderstanding of the shower situation in a football locker room. These are not enclosed spaces. This is wide open. There's lots of people coming in and out all the time. By the way, there was testimony that this was not unusual to have kids running around naked in the shower area with adult men. Well, the kids that were hanging around the program, friends of the coaches, sons of the coaches, that type of thing. I mean, so this is not, especially, I think there's many problems in this case, but one of the problems is that many of these allegations occur before the Catholic Church scandal has really been publicly known. but they come out afterwards. So they're seen through the prism of the Catholic Church scandals. How could you possibly do that in the post-Catholic Church scandal world? Well, that's not what was happening. This is State College. This is Happy Valley. This is a completely different culture, that is not nearly as cynical. It is not nearly as concerned about these issues. This was not considered to be verboten. Jerry Sandusky, by the way, himself grew up in a rec home where there was nudity everywhere, people swimming naked. I mean, this was a completely different era of American culture.
What's rec home?
Where like there's people coming in and out. There's lots of people living there. I mean, it's just a completely different environment and generation. But I don't want to get sidetracked because I want to answer your questions. You asked about the timeline. Okay, so there's this boy that he lifts up in a shower by Sandusky's telling to get the shampoo out of his hair, and the boy comes home. And the mother finds out he took a shower with Jerry Sandusky, and she's a bit perturbed by this. And she starts questioning what was going on here. And there's an investigation. And there's a full investigation of this. And the DA determines that the allegation was unfounded. There's never a charge. There's never an arrest. Sandusky is exonerated after a full investigation of this. And by the way, the child, with the mother's approval, he wasn't a young child. I think he was 11 or 12 years old at this time, engages in a decades-long relationship with Jerry Sandusky after this event, including the mother, grabbing Jerry Sandusky on the side of the road in his last home football game, begging him to let her son on the sidelines for the game. I mean, this was a situation where this mom, was facilitating a relationship with her son well after this allegation was found to be unfounded. By the way, she also sent not one but two of her daughters to Penn State well after this. So when the trial ends up happening, some 14 years later, when you read the testimony of this 1998 accuser, it literally sounds like he's a defense witness. I mean, literally, he sounds like he should have been put on by the defense because he's saying Jerry never did anything to me sexually. And, we had this great relationship and he was my friend. And this is, by the way, after he has a massive financial incentive to gin up his story because Penn State was already making it very clear they were going to pay millions and millions of dollars to people based upon the best story they have. So I actually used the 1998 story as basically the smoking gun. In fact, I'll get to the bottom, the end of the story here. That accuser, so-called victim number 6 in 1998, ended up losing millions and millions of dollars because his story was so pro Jerry Sandusky. He got paid by far the least amount of money by Penn State for his testimony at Jerry Sandusky's trial. So 1998 was a nothing burger. And we don't know for sure what Joe Paterno was told, but it is very likely, based upon the testimony that I have read and seen in person at Graham Spanier's trial, that Joe Paterno was informed that there was an investigation of Jerry and everything's fine, so he can keep coaching. So he coached for another 2 years. After that, the idea that somehow that resulted in his retirement is ludicrous. It did not. The timeline doesn't show that in any way, shape, or form. The logic and the evidence doesn't show that in any way, shape, or form. And that in reality, 1998 is a red herring. And for those who might say, well, I've never been investigated for child sex abuse. Isn't that suspicious inherently? It would be if you didn't run a charity for at-risk kids where you have contact with thousands of kids, literally thousands of kids over your lifetime, who all have a lot of abuse in their backgrounds. A lot of them might have financial incentives to make an allegation. They've all got crazy parents. I mean, I use the analogy of, well, why do you keep getting splinters on your hand? Well, because I'm a carpenter. I mean, it's basically part of the deal when you're running an at-risk a charity for at-risk kids, which Jerry Sandusky was doing. And so that's 1998. And then we go to the end of 2000 and the beginning of 2001. And this is where we get into that date situation, which, again, I'm happy to get into because I think it's the key to the whole case. But to get to the bottom line, I believe that what happened here was that Mike McQueary went in on a very slow night in late December. I believe the real date of this was December 20. I believe this is December 29th, 2000. I believe that's the real date that this occurred. December 29th, 2000. And I can explain why the dates that the prosecution gave are absolutely impossible. But I believe that on December 29th, 2000, a very slow night after watching the Peach Bowl in a college football game. Penn State was not playing in a bowl game that year because they stunk. They hadn't played in a game in a month. Mike McQueary is bored. He goes over to the Lash building to get something out of his locker. He hears the showers. He hears slapping sounds. And he later would claim that he saw or heard, it's still to this day ambiguous, Jerry Sandusky engaging in some sort of a sex act that he can't even describe or isn't even 100% sure he witnessed between Jerry Sandusky and a boy. And that obviously sounds absolutely horrific. However, if you understand the timeline, that's not possible. It's not consistent with what he told people when he told his story at all, including the Penn State administrators and Joe Paterno. But it's also not consistent with his own actions. Because if I'm right and this happened December 29, 2000, he doesn't go to see Joe Paterno to report this until the morning of February 10th, 2001. 6 weeks later. 6 weeks later. You don't wait 6 weeks to report the rape of a boy that you didn't stop. By the way, that's incredibly important. McQueary doesn't stop the rape.
McQuarrie's not a small man. I mean, he was a quarterback himself. I mean, I assume he's, to be a quarterback at Penn State, you have to be, 6'2" or something like that.
No, he was even bigger than that. He's a very large man. He's 6'4", I think 230, 235 at the time.
So he would be a generation younger. He was a quarterback in the 90s.
He was 2 generations younger, basically, than Jerry Sandusky at this time.
If he did think this was somehow Sandusky, I mean, I don't know how he could see, how we know it's Sandusky without being able to see Sandusky. If you just hear slapping sounds, but if he did think it was Sandusky, being, say, I don't know, 40 years, whatever the number is, 40 years younger, stronger, and a young man, in his 20s or 30s.
No, he was in his, I think he was 27-ish, and he was about 30-some years younger than Jerry Sandusky. He's in top
physical shape, and if there's some older guy who's 40 years his senior in the next room, why wouldn't he go smack him? Make some slap
or at the very 100%, or at the very least, if you think that's what's happening, you get that kid the hell out of there. All right. Instead, he leaves the kid there. The reason why he left the kid there was because what he witnessed was upsetting. It was made him uncomfortable, but he did not believe anything criminal was happening because Jerry Sandusky was known as a goofball. He was known as having these kids all the time. He was seen as a saint locally. And it wasn't, in my opinion, until 10 years later when prosecutors come to Mike and say, hey, we heard you saw Jerry Sandusky in the shower with a boy. Can you tell us what happened? Because let me tell you, we have an accuser of Jerry Sandusky who says he's been sexually abusing him for years. We think this guy's a monster. We need help putting him away. Well, I've used the analogy of the Loch Ness Monster. So if you're Mike McQueary in late 2000, basically what you see is a ripple in the water or a head poking out of the loch. And you go, boy, that's weird. I didn't, what was that all about? And maybe you tell a few friends about it. I saw this weird thing in the loch. I have no idea what it is. And then 10 years later, people you trust, investigators, prosecutors come to you and say, we heard you saw something in the loch. By the way, there's a Loch Ness Monster that we've been trying to catch for years. Can you help us catch the Loch Ness Monster? And McQueary was not.
It's not Loch Ness. It's locker room.
Okay. Well, if you're McQueary, you automatically go, oh my God, wait a minute. That thing I saw 10 years ago, which seemed weird, now seems criminal and ominous and nefarious, and I need to help them. And by the way, there were lots of reasons why McQueary was vulnerable to wanting to help the prosecutors. When McQueary first got the call from his wife, the investigators wanted to talk to him, McQueary panicked. We know this from an ESPN reporter, Don Van Natta, who I have a tape recording of this that's on YouTube. And Don Van Natta was going to report until ESPN censored it, that McQueary was convinced that investigators were coming to him because he had been sending pictures of his penis through a Penn State phone to a woman not his wife. And so when McQueary finally gets contacted by investigators and is told they want to talk about Jerry Sandusky, he couldn't be more thrilled. And he couldn't be more thrilled to tell them whatever it is they want to hear, because he just wants out of this. By the way, he was also vulnerable on the issue of having bet on college football games. It's very clear that Mike McQueary bet on Penn State games. There's even a YouTube video of a game against Rutgers where there's almost a fight at the end of the game between Joe Paterno and the Rutgers coach, because on the last play of the game, McQueary, with Penn State way ahead, decides to throw a pass for a touchdown that causes Penn State to cover the spread. So McQueary is no choir boy, okay? McQueary is somebody whose word is not to be trusted. His actions are not to be trusted. His motivations are not to be trusted. And let me just finish on McQueary and this part of McQueary this way. So he goes to see Joe Paterno on the morning of February 10th, 2001. We know this because of emails. This is why the prosecution had to change the date from 2002 to 2001. Well, what happened to provoke that? Under my theory, it's been 6 weeks since this Sandusky episode actually occurred, and I can prove why that is. But I know it's been 6 weeks. And by the way, my theory even matches up with the prosecution witnesses better than their own theory does, far better. Well, what happens on February 9th, the day before McQueary goes to see Paterno? It's not that he witnessed Jerry Sandusky in a shower with a young boy raping him, because that would be urgency, right? That would make some sense in the prosecution's mind. You might give McQueary to the next morning to go see Joe Paterno. Why he would go to Paterno and not the police, no one's ever answered that. But okay, fine. Joe Paterno is his boss. Jerry doesn't work for him anymore, but okay, I'm still trying to figure out why this would make sense. But in the prosecution's mind, this is the best they have. It wasn't that he witnessed it that day. It's that morning in the paper on February 9th, McQueary reads that Kenny Jackson has left Penn State to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Kenny Jackson was the wide receivers coach at Penn State. The wide receivers coaching job is the position McQueary wanted. McQueary was currently a graduate assistant, which is basically you're lower than dirt. You don't even have health insurance. He needed a full-time job. That was the job he wanted. And by the way, had there been a cover-up, Randy, this is the smoking gun. There was no cover-up. Had there been a cover-up, the first thing Joe Paterno would have said to Mike McQueary is, wow, okay, thanks for coming to us with this information. We really appreciate it. Keep this to yourself, which, by the way, Paterno never said, even by McQueary's own account. But congratulations, by the way. I don't know if you heard, but Kenny Jackson just left to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers, and we have a brand new job that's wide open. I think you'd be perfect for it, Mike. What do you say? Congratulations, you're our new wide receivers coach. And by the way, just remember, keep this between ourselves. None of that happened. McQueary did not get the job. In fact, he didn't get the job until 3 years later when it opened up a second time. So the cover-up theory is that they had this job to give a graduate assistant that they didn't give him, the only witness in the cover-up. And they left him hanging for 3 years, where he could have at any moment gone to the press or gone to the school administrators or anybody to say, what's going on here? I witnessed Jerry Sandusky raping a boy in the shower, and Penn State's not doing anything about it. I mean, he would have had a tremendous whistleblower lawsuit. He could have blackmailed them into giving them a much better job than even the wide receivers coaching position. None of that happened.
Yeah.
Right. Joe Paterno would have gotten fired over this. He had, it's just absurd. The whole thing is absurd. Every element of the story is absurd. But the bottom line of this is Mike McQueary goes to Joe Paterno mostly because there's an open job. And I have theories as to why Sandusky came up in this incredibly short conversation. Sue Paterno, who by all accounts has a legendary memory, Joe Paterno's widow, was there that day. And we have an email from Sue Paterno, one integral in this case, stating unequivocally that the quote-unquote meeting that has been made so much of between Joe Paterno and Mike McQueary to discuss this allegation of rape that started this whole thing took 3 minutes. 3 minutes. It's not 5, not 10. Sue says she remembers it being a 3-minute conversation, ironically, as Joe Paterno was getting out of the shower to get ready to go to an event in Pittsburgh that night, which, by the way, is true because we know his schedule. And so you cannot tell Joe Paterno, an old legendary football coach, in 3 minutes that you witnessed Jerry Sandusky raping a boy in the shower the night before. That is not possible in any way, shape, or form. Not possible. And it didn't happen. And what really did happen is a completely different narrative, which is inconsistent with anybody being guilty in this case.
So was this at Joe Paterno's house? And Sue did not hear the conversation.
She did not hear the conversation, but interestingly, okay, let's do the math on this. Okay, let's use our common sense, right? Let's say that Mike McQueary comes over that morning and tells Joe Paterno that he saw Jerry Sandusky raping a boy in the Penn State shower the night before. You think Joe's going to mention that to Sue? You think Joe's going to go, "Oh my God, I can't believe what Mike McQueary just told me," right? That would be a conversation a man would have with his wife of many, many decades. But if it's, oh, by the way, coach, I saw Jerry recently in a shower with a boy again. Could we tell him to knock it off? Because it's making me uncomfortable, and I don't understand why he's doing it. And Joe goes, "Yeah, sure, I'll take care of it, Mike, thanks." That's a 3-minute conversation. And that's not a conversation you would necessarily share with your wife, but you would share. You mean, it would be obvious from your reaction. But can we just please use our brains for a second? Joe would be crestfallen. He would be beside himself, and Sue, at the very least, would ask, "What the hell was that all about?" And none of that happened because none of this occurred.
Yeah, this is I bring this up in my book. I was a Sherlock Holmes fan as a kid. Kind of really whet my appetite for reading in high school and so forth. I read them over and over again. There's I think it's the Silver Blaze. There's the story of the dog that did not bark in the night. Are you aware of that? So Holmes,
I don't think so.
So Holmes is investigating a case because that's what he does, and he's mentioning to the inspector, "What about the dog that did not bark?" Negative fact is a fact if you look carefully.
Right.
In this case, it meant that the dog knew the intruder, and for this story that figures in because so it's not like the dog you heard something, the dog was barking, going nuts. It was the fact that the dog didn't go nuts. That's your evidence.
No, I think that's a good analogy. That's a good analogy. And by the way, if you got it, I urge you to listen to the first episode of With the Benefit of Hindsight, because if you like Sherlock Holmes, you're going to enjoy the evolution of the dates, because the date really is the drop the mic moment. When you realize that I'm right about December 29th, 2000, and how that fits with everybody's testimony, everybody's on both sides of this, and how February 9th, 2001, the second date that the prosecution was forced to use at trial, doesn't fit at all. It doesn't fit at all. It doesn't even fit with Mike McQueary's own testimony, because his claim is that he was watching the movie Rudy that night, and the movie Rudy has barely begun when he needs to be the last building, and not to mention, there's all sorts of problems with the Rudy movie element of the story. But the prosecution was very proud of themselves because Rudy was airing on cable television in State College on the night in question. And that was really the only connection that they had to try to prove what the date was. And they got it wrong, not just once, but twice. And it's the key to the whole case.
All right. So as far as interviews, have you interviewed Mike McQueary and have you interviewed Jerry Sandusky?
Well, I have asked Mike McQueary numerous times to interview him, and he, of course, will never be interviewed by me because he would get destroyed. I have interviewed Jerry Sandusky twice in prison twice on the phone and twice in prison. I would say for a total of about 6 hours, thereabouts. Some of it was just normal conversation, but I would say hardcore interviewing for about 5 hours in and out of prison on multiple different occasions. I began believing that Jerry Sandusky was guilty of most, if not all, of the allegations against him. That's what I said on the Today Show the first time I went on to talk about this case. And I left after the second meeting in prison, completely convinced that he was not just innocent, but obviously innocent. And it's not because, I want to make this clear, it's not because I was believing anything that he was telling me. In fact, my fallback position on everything he said was it must be a lie until proven otherwise. And I spent about a year trying to find something that Jerry Sandusky had told me that was not true. And I could not do it. I couldn't even come close to do it. And it's because Jerry Sandusky is not a liar. Jerry Sandusky tells the truth, often to his own detriment. And so after reinvestigating the case and realizing, some of the seeds or the breadcrumbs, I guess you will, that Sandusky had left for me, I was able to figure out for myself. I'm the one that's figured out the narrative of what really happened here. I'm one that was able to finally convince Jerry that the date of this episode was December 29, 2000. And his attorneys should have been able to figure this out before the trial. Unfortunately, they were so overwhelmed and so in over their head, they could not do it. Although I will say that my biggest mistake in this entire investigation, it's simultaneously the most important revelation that I've uncovered, but it's also my biggest mistake, was that my gut was telling me after that first Jerry Sandusky interview that even the second date is wrong of the McQueary episode. Everything was telling me this. I knew that Jerry Sandusky was positive in his bones that second date was still wrong. And it just didn't make any sense to me. How could the prosecution screw this up not just once, but twice? How could McQueary screw it up not once, but twice? How could Sandusky's defense not figure out what the real date was? And I started a rudimentary investigation into this and got sidetracked with the entire buildup to the Today Show interview. And I kind of tabled it. And it was the biggest mistake I've made because I did not follow my own instincts. And that's something that I've learned is almost always a mistake. You got to follow your instincts. And my instinct was that date was wrong. I'm positive I'm right that date was wrong. But I should have gone down that path sooner and more vigorously, and I didn't. And that was probably my biggest regret in the entire investigation.
So I'm going to segue slightly. Graham Spanier, is that the right pronunciation?
Yes.
What happened to him? Have you interviewed him? What do you think is the underlying narrative? I guess that would be one question. And the other one is like on TV, watch a movie or whatever, the guy gets his retrial, he gets freed and so forth. DNA evidence, something happens. So there's overturning. It doesn't sound like there's much prospect for overturning any of this. So I don't know if you take either one of those questions.
Well, those are two good questions. They're very, very different. Graham and I know each other very well. Graham is the former president of the Penn State, a guy who had an extraordinary reputation up until this whole thing happened. It was probably one of the most esteemed college presidents in the country. And he and I have a very interesting relationship because I'm very conservative and he's very liberal. But I think we have a mutual respect. I think he's a great gentleman. And I think he's probably the nicest person I've met in this entire situation. I have huge problems with the way that he has handled certain things. He's written a book recently where if you read the book carefully, you can easily conclude that not only is he innocent, but Jerry Sandusky is also innocent. I know Graham believes Jerry to be innocent, but unfortunately, Graham, for whatever political reason, will not state that openly. He'll say things like he deserves a new trial, I think. I think that's his his stance or something like that. But everyone's so afraid of speaking the ultimate truth in this case because I guess, your friends will get mad at you or you'll be kicked out of the club, especially as a liberal, because I think it's against the liberal religion to even consider that all these so-called victims could be not telling the truth. But I've interviewed Graham officially. I've talked to him for hours and hours and hours, on the phone, off the record, but I've interviewed him a couple times on the record, including for our podcast where he did a 4-hour plus interview with me, an interview that really, if you want to learn about the alleged cover-up and what a joke that is, that's probably the place to go. Because, I'm positive no one's ever done a more detailed, extensive interview on this case than the 4-hour plus interview I did with Graham Spanier. In fact, Graham Spanier was told by Penn State's counsel recently that they had listened to the interview that I did with Graham Spanier, the 4-hour plus interview, and that they had determined that he had done nothing wrong. Now, they haven't said that publicly, but that's what they said privately to him. What happened to Graham Spanier is maybe the greatest injustice, not only in this case, it might be the greatest injustice that I've ever even heard of in the modern history of America, and that includes the O.J. Simpson case. Because even if Jerry Sandusky was guilty as hell, Graham Spanier did nothing wrong, nothing. And from a factual standpoint, an evidence perspective, as well as a legal standpoint, there is no case against Graham Spanier, and he was convicted on a misdemeanor. The jury foreman immediately the next day told the press, I think we made a mistake here. The next day, the jury foreman said that. I think we made a mistake. Then the case got overturned by a federal judge because it was legally completely bankrupt. There was so many problems legally with the case and with the verdict that it got overturned. And then the state court, led by the now governor of Pennsylvania, Shapiro, who had an absolute vendetta against Penn State and specifically Graham Spanier, went out of this has never happened before, I'm sure, in the history of America, where a federal court has tossed out a misdemeanor conviction, and the state court appealed that and went to extraordinary lengths to get the misdemeanor conviction, right, misdemeanor, restored. The amount of time and resources alone it took to do this is ridiculous for a misdemeanor. And so then Spanier ended up going to prison for a couple of months because of it, and then having home confinement and all sorts of other restrictions. And he did nothing wrong. And again, even if Sandusky was guilty, but Sandusky isn't guilty, so it's even more of an absurdity. So that's Graham Spanier. As far as why this can't be fixed, this to me is a perfect storm situation. The great irony of one of the many reasons why the case can never be fixed, is because there's no evidence. And you might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, no, because the way our appeals process works, the best way, there's a couple good ways to get an appeal. One of which is if certain pieces of evidence turn out to be fraudulent. Well, there was no evidence here. It's all word of mouth. It's all people who have been paid millions of dollars for their testimony. No one's going to go back on their testimony because they're literally being paid millions of dollars not to do so. And then you have a situation where, because there's no physical evidence, it's not like, someone's DNA can show up or be found or whatever. I've actually I once joked with Joe Amendola, Jerry Sandusky's original defense attorney, that if he realized that Jerry was going to be railroaded, he should have planted some false evidence against him so that he would have a shot on appeal. But when there's no evidence against you, it's literally like trying to shoot ghosts. But the most important part of the problem here is the entire state of Pennsylvania is invested, literally invested in Jerry Sandusky's guilt. And every single judge in Pennsylvania is elected. These are all elected judges, the ones that matter. And so no judge that is elected is going to make a ruling that either lets Jerry Sandusky out of prison or forces these poor innocent victims to have to go back and retestify in their case, that's never going to happen, especially when the media is at least as invested as the judicial process is in Jerry Sandusky's guilt, because the media doesn't want to acknowledge that they blew this. So you'll get no positive media coverage for this effort. If Jerry Sandusky was black, or if he was gay, or he had something on which the liberal media could put their hat and give them a hook for championing his cause, he would have a chance. But he's a straight white old male who is seen as the most hated man in America, who abused children, and nobody's going to rush to his cause. And they're certainly not going to do so because me, a non-celebrity who is hated by the media to the extent that they even know about me, is telling them that they're wrong. Now, there have been other people. Malcolm Gladwell, speaking of Spaniard, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a chapter in his book, Talking with Strangers, chapter number 5, using a lot of my work, citing my work, exonerating Spaniard, and frankly raising questions about Sandusky. And I think Gladwell thought, because he's a best-selling author, he thought that just doing that would start to raise questions about the case. He completely miscalculated. I told him he had miscalculated, that this was not going to do anything. And in fact, what I think happened was even the little bit that he did caused him to get so much blowback that he got scared, and he basically stopped talking about it almost entirely in the future. Even when the Spaniard case really, I think, in a rational world would have caused Gladwell to make more public statements about it. So Gladwell is really kind of the exception that proves the rule. He was one of the few mainstream guys that had the guts to put his toe in the water, but he found the water to be so inhospitable that he immediately ran away, because no one wants to have happen to them what's happened to me. Much of my life has been destroyed by this case. This has been what should have been the best thing that ever happened to my career is the worst thing that's ever happened to my career, because we're living in such an upside down world. So Jerry is still appealing. I have been urging him to appeal to federal court for years. I thought I was successful in doing that, and then he changed his mind. He has no chance in Pennsylvania state court for purely political reasons.
How can he appeal federally?
And also,
what's the federal aspect of this?
The federal aspect is that he didn't get a fair trial. And so, a habeas corpus, this is, there's all sorts of constitutional issues with his trial. And it's always an uphill battle. But at least in the federal court, you would have a situation where the judge was not elected and was not invested in the case. And I think a rational federal judge would just look at the due process aspect of that trial and go, what the hell was this? Because just from a pure due process standpoint, I am not exaggerating when I say that trial was Salem witch-like. It was an abomination. And it was an abomination because of this moral panic and this media firestorm that occurred, especially in State College back in November of 2011.
Kind of ironic that they have a state college in a place named State College. I'm joking. But a better question would be your career. You spent time on this. Is this your job? Have you been remunerated at all for your forays in this field?
Well, I've lost money doing this case, purposely so. I got paid a little bit for the podcast with the benefit of hindsight, but it was nowhere near what I've spent. Heck, if only on legal fees. I got arrested in this case, bizarrely and absurdly, and that cost me thousands of dollars to defend myself. And I eventually was exonerated. You're not going to believe it. I got arrested for sitting in an auditorium for an event where I had a ticket in my own name. That's what I got arrested for. That's how crazy this case is. I'm not exaggerating.
Sitting in an auditorium with a ticket.
Yeah, that's what I got arrested for.
Where was it, on campus?
I got it. It was on a high school, in a high school auditorium where Matt Sandusky, the former, I guess, adopted son of Jerry and Dottie Sandusky, was speaking. And of course, he became a victim. He's the most obviously fraudulent victim of them all. By the way, his mother, his adopted mother, Dottie, was there at that same event, along with his former brother via adoption, who was also there, who also knows Matt is a sack of crap. And I went there with the hope of confronting Matt Sandusky. And Matt Sandusky was so terrified of me, because he knows I know the truth, that he refused to start the program unless I was removed from the auditorium. And well, there's video of all this. And I was first told I was told I could sit in the front row. Then I was told to move. So I moved and I went, 12 rows back, and was just sitting there on the aisle waiting. And I started to suspect, because I knew they were targeting me. I mean, the police had already spoken to me maybe twice at this point to tell me not to do anything, and I was like, okay, fine. And I think I had even tweeted that the chances of me getting arrested seemed to be pretty high as I'm sitting there in my seat. And then all of a sudden they told me I had to leave. And I had traveled from Los Angeles, California to the boondocks of Pennsylvania to be there. And I had a ticket in my own name. I was not going to leave. They had no reason for me. They had no justification for me to leave. And they physically yanked me out of my chair and dragged me out of the room, and then slammed me to the ground, handcuffed me. I mean, I had marks all over my arms. I was abused. It was, in a rational world, I would have been seen as a journalistic hero, and I would have probably won a lot of money in a settlement against the school and everybody else that was involved in this fiasco. But I'm telling you, that story is emblematic of this entire situation, because the good guys are the bad guys and the bad guys are the good guys. And, the fact that, this cost me, I think that situation cost me at least $6,000, maybe more than that, plus a whole lot of aggravation in order to defend myself. It's emblematic of the entire injustice. I mean, everything's upside down. I'm not exaggerating. You can go look for yourself. It's all on video. And this is really what happened. But this is the true nature of this case, and why, it's a mythology that's been created by the mainstream news media. And now everyone sees everything through the prism of, the white hats and the black hats. But it's all the opposite of reality.
So I've had on Daniel Flynn, who wrote The War on Football. I read the book some time ago, probably 8 or 9 years ago. It's a fascinating book, and it talks about the war on football. American football, it's kind of obviously, there's mom, apple pie, Thanksgiving, football. And, one of the pillars of kind of the male American ethos. And there's been a, kind of political war against it. And his book talks about some of the exaggerations regarding concussions and whatnot, certainly for the younger ages when they're not at high speed. And he dissects a lot of this industry where people have already made up their minds about what is dangerous and not, and so forth. But do you think there's an element of that with the Penn State thing that's kind of like analogous to the war in football? I mean, here we have, Penn State, kind of the bastion of, Pennsylvania, essentially kind of like the creche of football in America. I mean, Dan Marino and Joe Montana, Joe Namath, and all the kind of Pennsylvania guys. The epitome of tough, skilled players and so forth. And football, in part is kind of the secular sports religion for a good part of the country. Do you think that this was made kind of perversely a very easy target for those who wanted to get right at the heart of it, stick a dagger?
Absolutely. It may not have been 100% conscious, but it absolutely played a role in this. There were a lot of elements of the perfect storm here, and that was one of them. I mean, the media loves attacking football in general, and especially people who are perceived as, goody two shoes or beacons of principle like Joe Paterno was. By the way, Joe Paterno was a well-known Republican. That did not help at all when it came to the way he was treated by the news media. He had had a long war with the news media. He had disdain for them, and they were lusting for some opportunity to finally get him, to bring him down. And when they got it, they went after it full bore. And so not only is this, let's face it, this is an amazing Greek tragedy, right? If true. I mean, so there's a lot of the story that would always be enticing to the news media. But when you consider the destruction of football and its place in the culture and demystifying it, there's no question that played an important role in driving why the media loved this story so very much. And I would even go a little bit further. And I would say that what has happened to college sports, I mean, right now we are in a situation in 2023 where college sports is dead. There is no such thing as college sports. With NIL money and transfers and massive realignment and no one giving a damn about academics, and it's all about money. And now we're going to have schools traveling all over the country. You know, who cares about carbon footprint, I guess. The entire essence of college sports is dead. And I got to say, again, not consciously, maybe subconsciously or whatever, but there's a straight line from the destruction of Joe Paterno in November 2011 to the destruction of college sports in general by, here we are now in August of 2023. And I think that part of what happened here was that when the powers that be at ESPN and elsewhere realized that they could destroy Joe Paterno, the beacon of all that was supposed to be good in college sports and in general and college football in particular, and get no blowback nationally and almost no blowback even from Penn State, because Penn State became so cowed and became virtue signalers to the rest of the world that, to throw their own people under the bus to show everybody how against child molestation they were. When they got away with that, I think they realized, you know what, we can do anything. We can get away with anything and there's not going to be blowback. We can put USC and UCLA in the goddamn Big Ten conference and nobody's going to really make much of a fuss about it. We can allow transfers to go instantaneously from one school to the next. We can pay players directly in ways that used to be completely forbidden and then it's completely unregulated. And so, again, I'm not saying I'm an anti-conspiracy person. I hate conspiracies. But I don't think it's a coincidence that it's really right after Joe Paterno gets destroyed that the floodgates open and that there's this straight line from then. I mean, if you look at the environment of college sports in November 2011 compared to what it is today, I mean, it's basically completely different sports, completely different entities. And I think the destruction of Joe Paterno played a significant role in that.
Well, you bring up a few questions. I'm going to maybe get to them or not. But I while you were talking, I was thinking about the Duke lacrosse case. What year was that? And did that have any bearing on kind of, maybe, obviously there was not enough applied skepticism, but allegations are not always true, which is shocking, right? I mean, believe all women. I don't know if that was not a slogan back in the Duke lacrosse days. Was there any overlap between those two cases at all in terms of, any kind of people applying scrutiny or skepticism?
Well, the irony is that there should have been overlap. I mean, the media should have learned their lesson on Duke lacrosse because Duke lacrosse occurred before Penn State, well before Penn State. It happened actually in 2006. The Penn State case occurred 5 years later. Well, by that point, Duke lacrosse had already been fixed. And the reason why the media was able to fix Duke lacrosse was that it never got to the levels of Penn State Paterno. I mean, obviously it's lacrosse and there wasn't a Joe Paterno figure. It wasn't football and it wasn't Joe Paterno. So it was a much smaller story.
Yeah. Duke is not, I mean, not for basketball maybe, but for the
Right.
other sports not really on the map so much.
Well, but it's so so my point is they hadn't put all their chips down on Duke lacrosse. On Penn State, they put all their chips down. It was a lot like the precursor to COVID. On COVID, they put all their chips down. And so when they put all their chips down, they can't be wrong. They only put a few chips down on Duke lacrosse. And when Duke lacrosse got fixed, that should have been a warning to the media. Hey, maybe we hold off. Maybe we wait. Maybe we find out what the actual facts are here. But this story was too juicy for that to happen.
For Graham Spanier, I think his name is Richard Broadhead. I'm familiar because I went to Yale, and he was a dean of something or other when I was at Yale, and he went on to become the president at Duke, my understanding, or dean of something. I think he was the president at Duke at the time, and he went after the white Duke lacrosse students who supposedly had done all these racial things to women who were being paid for their. I think they were stupid to have this type of entertainment. I think it was on campus, but whatever the thing was, the whole episode, I think they had black strippers, black women who are strippers come to the thing, and then they alleged that they were, I don't know, mishandled. I don't know, was it rape? I forget what it was. All these allegations from women who get money for a living through illicit activity. Go figure. But I think Broadhead went after the students, full bore. I'm wondering whether, for one way or another, whether Graham Spanier and took any thoughts or lessons from that, and if anything he did. I mean, it's really kind of I don't really know enough to ask this question intelligently, so I'm just going to maybe leave it there as roadkill, or if you want to touch that at all, I don't know.
Well, I think what you're saying is it possible that Graham Spanier and others at Penn State were hesitant to punish Sandusky for unproven allegations because of other situations? Is that what you're?
That's it.
Okay. Well, if you look at the timeline, Duke lacrosse doesn't really fit into that because the situations involving Sandusky were taken care of before Duke lacrosse, but then came out after Duke lacrosse because there was this 10-year gap between, for instance, the McQueary episode and when it becomes public. However, your point is inadvertently a good one because there were things happening at Penn State at the time period of when Sandusky's situation came to their attention. And a couple of them definitely would have worked in that direction. And one of them, by the way, involved a Penn State football player by the name of Rashard Casey. And it wasn't sexual, but Casey was the quarterback, a black quarterback, who had been accused of beating up a police officer. And I think it was in a bar. I'm a little hazy on the details, but I actually interviewed Rashard Casey for my documentary film, The Framing of Joe Paterno, which you can find on YouTube. And the thing was, Paterno stuck by Casey in a huge way. And this all happened right around the same time period, just before the McQueary allegation would have come to their attention. And it turned out Casey got exonerated. In fact, he got a settlement from the police department, I believe, for a significant amount of money. So Casey had been, had a false allegation against him that the media, including, by the way, myself, because I was a radio talk show host at a sports station in Philadelphia at the time, and I remember railing on this situation because it sounded so horrendous. Why was Paterno standing by Rashard Casey? Well, Paterno was right to do that because Casey turned out to be innocent. And so it's, either consciously or subliminally, though those kinds of things could have played a role. But I actually, as I usually have, a contrarian opinion. When I look at how Penn State handled Sandusky, based upon what I know to the reality to be, I think they were actually too tough on Jerry Sandusky. I mean, I think Jerry did a lot of stupid things, but I think it was very obvious, given the context of the time, that Jerry Sandusky was not a harm to children. They were trying, I think, to get the message across to him that he was doing things that could get himself in trouble, not because he was doing something evil, but because he was just being dumb. And so I have no problem. I am not of the opinion that Penn State, soft pedaled Jerry Sandusky. I think at worst, they handled it exactly right. And if anything, I think they might have been too tough on him.
So we're going to maybe round out the hour in a little bit, but a couple of questions about Jerry Sandusky's own family. I gather he adopted. Did he have natural children as well? And where did his family kind of figure into this? And did they defend him? Did they throw him under the bus? I mean, did they believe the allegations? What happened there? What has been happening? I know you mentioned his adoptive son.
Well, he had no natural born children, which I think is a large part of this issue. I mean, he had 6 adopted kids, if you include Matt Sandusky, 5 of whom have supported him totally throughout this whole thing because they know Matt is lying and that they know their adopted father is innocent. I did an extensive interview with E.J. Sandusky and his wife for the With the Benefit of Hindsight podcast that to a lot of people is really the ultimate proof of innocence because, these people knew Jerry their whole lives and they knew Matt and they know many of the accusers and they were there and they are positive that Jerry is innocent. His wife Dottie is positive that he's innocent. I set up and appeared with Dottie Sandusky in an interview with Matt Lauer from her home in 2014, where she declared that for the first time that she knows that Jerry Sandusky is in fact innocent. And as far as the not having natural children, I think that's an important part of the story. Not only did it make them vulnerable by having an adopted son named Matt Sandusky, they also had dozens of foster children that came in and out of the Sandusky house. Weirdly, none of the foster children ever made an allegation of sex abuse when you would think
and like you said above, these are kids from troubled households.
Right. I mean, these are, and by the way, if Jerry Sandusky was a child molester and he was going to molest one of his children, he wouldn't have picked Matt. He would have picked Jeff, who is very, very slow. No, I'm serious, because Jeff is very, very slow. He could have easily gotten away with it with Jeff. Matt is a scoundrel. Everyone knew he was a scoundrel. And Jeff has a tattoo on his arm, Sandusky Forever, mocking Matt having temporarily changed his name before he realized that no one would care about him if he didn't have the last name Sandusky. So he changed it back to Sandusky before starring in a documentary film. So the family completely, other than Matt, completely supports Jerry Sandusky to this day. And, I think not being able to have biological children is an important part of this story on a number of levels, including when you look at Jerry Sandusky's medical records, which we now have, which were not presented at trial for reasons I do not fully understand. He had no testosterone at all. He at the time period of the key allegations, he had so little testosterone in his body that he was falling asleep at the wheel while driving. So the idea that he was raping teenage boys, with no drugs, no alcohol, no pornography, at his age, is just ridiculous. I mean, it's an absurd. Let me ask you,
as far as drugs and all that kind of stuff, was he? First of all,
let me finish on the medical record. Randy, let me finish on the medical records, because there's one other point. It's not just he had no testosterone. His medical records state unequivocally he had, quote, virtually no testicular matter. Virtually no testicular matter. That is a quote from his medical records. Jerry Sandusky had no balls. And I have stated many times since we revealed that even that piece of information, which again the jury never heard, has been misinterpreted. I mean, people think, well, John, that doesn't mean he couldn't have abused these kids. Or you're not saying that, are you? No, but I do think it should make you question, given the nature of these allegations that are like porn movies, that he could have done this. Here's where the lack of testicles matters. We have 36 men who have been paid by Penn State who are on the record claiming that they were sexually abused by Jerry Sandusky. Several of the key ones indicate that they were with Jerry Sandusky or forced to be with Jerry Sandusky dozens, if not over 100 times. And not one of them ever mentioned that Jerry has no balls. Not one of them. It's not possible. It's not possible. If any of these stories were true, that would have been $1 million ticket, a multi-million-dollar ticket. That's in the Michael Jackson case, allegedly, although erroneously, that was a key part of the evidence was.
Yeah, and Bill Clinton apparently has Peronis. I get what you're saying. It goes back to the dog that didn't bark.
Right.
So did he have kind of? You mentioned Joe Paterno being Roman Catholic. Did Jerry Sandusky go to church? Did he drink? Did he drug? Did he have other misdemeanors? Were there other character aspects?
Jerry Sandusky, up until this happened, was considered to be the most quintessential choir boy of all time. Now, it's funny that you inadvertently put your finger on what I think is one of the most underrated factors in the perfect storm here. Dottie and Jerry are not Catholic. I believe they're Presbyterian, but they're Protestant. And I think the Catholic Protestant divide created a massive problem between the Paternos and the Sanduskys that ended up helping the rift that occurred when this whole situation happened. And I'm happy to do so, but I don't think we need to get into the details as to why. But as far as Jerry's behavior, no one has ever seen him take a drink, ever. No one's ever seen him smoke. He's never taken any drugs. I mean, he wouldn't allow any of his kids to do any of that, whether they were in the charity or whether they were his adopted kids. I mean, he was as straight as an arrow you could possibly be. And there's not a story of a kid being given, with any kind of proof that they were given alcohol or drugs or pornography. No pornography was ever found anywhere near Jerry Sandusky, which in the modern era is an impossibility for a serial child sex predator. I mean, it's literally the first thing the authorities look for. And yet nothing on his email, nothing on his computer, nothing found in his home. They floated this story, which the media bought early on in the case, that there were pictures of the victims found in Jerry's house. And that sounded like bum, bum, bum. These were framed photographs of Jerry, arm in arm with these kids he thought of as sons. That's all they were. There was nothing remotely pornographic about any of them, but the media portrayed it as nefarious, which it was not. But, if I was going to state one unequivocal fact for people to open their minds about this case, that would be it. Because it's completely unheard of for there to be a child sex predator in the modern era with no pornography. It's just not, it's not possible. It's almost like having, trying to make water without oxygen. You can't do it. I mean, it's just not there. And so, going back to the dog didn't bark. I mean, the absence of evidence where there should be. I think the biggest misconception people have about sex abuse cases. They think that somehow magically that there's no evidence in these cases. That's just bullshit. There's plenty of evidence, and it's usually pornography. And by the way, how the hell do you get heterosexual teenage boys, which is the general allegation here? People think that these allegations were 7, 8, 9-year-old boys. Bullshit. They were 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old boys, which is a completely different world, especially when you're talking about heterosexual boys. How do you get heterosexual boys to engage in homosexual sex acts with no drugs, no payoffs, no alcohol, no pornography, no beatings, no nothing? It's not possible. And every single one of these accusers, to the best we can tell, is heterosexual. And by the way,
sorry,
let me just finish. One of the demographics that is most easily convinced that in my experience, by my argument, are homosexual men. Homosexual men look at the stories of this case and they go, this is absurd. They see it as homosexual porn being written by straight men. And since the accusers were straight and most of their lawyers, I'm I believe to be straight. That's where the stories were written. They're exactly right. These were homosexual porn stories written by straight men for the purposes of making money. That's what happened in the Jerry Sandusky case.
So the young men, whatever, who testified, at what age did they testify? Were their names leaked or whatever? Or did they have to announce?
They were
themselves?
all adults. There were no children who testified. They were
So the
all
adults,
legal adults.
Did they have their names on the paper? Because, you know, even if there were $1 million out there to be had, you know, I wouldn't, you know, if I were destitute in need of money, I mean, who knows how people answer this question, but, you know, would I want to put my name out as having been, you know, in the shower with a guy, you know, if it weren't true, even to get $1 million, did people have to announce their names to get that? Did they make themselves public?
Well, that's another interesting question. Their names are part of the public record. They're in the court record. But the news media decided arbitrarily, with no basis whatsoever, even because they're adults. These are not children. These are all adults. The news media decided to give them complete, total blanket protection, even when they didn't actually testify. When I went on the Today Show the first time, my plan was to reveal the name of the boy that was in the shower when Mike McQueary walked in, who is the key to the whole story, because he makes it clear nothing happened. And I thought this was a no-brainer because he did not testify at trial. No accuser testified in that episode because the prosecution knew that they didn't like this kid's story. Now, an adult, they didn't like his story. And NBC Today Show, the lawyers prevented me from saying the name. We actually had to tape. We had to bring Matt Lauer in an hour earlier than normal to tape that interview because they were so afraid that I was going to say the name of an adult who had been paid or was in the process of being paid millions of dollars anonymously, who never testified as a victim. So he got victim treatment and anonymity without ever having claimed at that point to be a victim. I mean, that's how insane the media is on this. And to me, the idea of protecting the identity of adult accusers is completely insane because, yes, okay, it makes it a little bit more difficult to testify. I would argue that in this day and age where everyone wants to be a victim, it doesn't make it that much more difficult. I mean, we've now become a victim society. But hold on a second. What about the rights of the accused? Someone's identity is incredibly important to their credibility.
Absolutely.
And by the way, had the identities been known, all right, I guarantee you what I know about this case, there would have been people coming out of the woodwork who would have said, what? Wait a minute. So-and-so is testifying against Jerry Sandusky. I know so-and-so. And I know that they said this, and this about Jerry and how awesome he is.
Yeah, it'll be one of those things
in recent times.
Right. Did they say anything at the time? Like Christine Blasey Ford never said anything to anybody for decades, whatever. And then she suddenly remembered it when, you know, there was potentially, you know, money and fame and attention and a book deal coming out of it. Yeah, no, there's a lot to be said for that. So I'm going to maybe call it a day, but I'm going to give you a last chance to maybe summarize or put in any questions I didn't ask. What are your closing thoughts? Well, actually, I do have one question, which is, do you have any resonance on Penn State campus itself? Are there historians there, you know, paid professorial historians or college boosters or whatever who want to take up your mantle and produce, you know, kind of the opposite, you know, it's like mock trial, maybe in the Penn State Law School if there is one. I mean, is there anything going on?
Well, you're living in a naive world where those things might still happen because people care about the truth.
It's me and
there are two Penn State professors, one of whom wrote a book that was critical of Joe Paterno when this broke. There are two Penn State professors who have publicly written that now believe they were wrong about the case and that Jerry is innocent. Now, you would think that would be a story, right? I mean, especially since one guy wrote a book, a prominent book, condemning Penn State at the beginning. Now they've completely reversed themselves. But of course, that's part of the media cover-up. That happened and no one cared. And I've had extensive contact with these guys, and because they're, liberal academics and I'm a conservative, we didn't get along very well. But they're part of the equation. There are members of the Penn State Board of Trustees, both current and former, who know that Jerry Sandusky is innocent. They won't make that clear publicly, but they know it. Now, a couple of them did on our podcast with the benefit of hindsight. Two former Penn State board members, Bob Capretto and Al Lord, very, very, very prominent people who have unequivocally stated they know Jerry Sandusky to be innocent. And they are former Penn State Board of Trustees members. Gary Schultz, who went to jail in this case, did an interview with me saying that he knows Jerry Sandusky or believes Jerry Sandusky to be innocent. Graham Spanier, I think, has made it clear he really thinks that Jerry Sandusky is innocent, even if he doesn't say those words. I mean, there are all sorts of people within the Penn State world, and it's my understanding, and I become such a pessimist that I never get my hopes up on anything, but there has been a renewed effort among some Penn Staters within the last few months to raise some money with a real serious effort to try to revisit this and to correct the injustice. I don't think they're going to be successful, but there is some renewed enthusiasm within the Penn State community. But I'm not optimistic that anything's ever going to happen on this. But I do know what the truth is. And if you care about the truth, and if you care about an amazing story, and you care about learning about how the media really works or doesn't work, I would urge you to listen to our podcast with the benefit of hindsight, which you can find in all the normal places you get podcasts.
Does Bill O'Brien have any thoughts on this?
I have no idea what Bill O'Brien's view is. My guess is he probably has doubts, because most football coaches know that this story is bullcrap. I mean, if you look at, there's been also, again, this kind of goes back to the dog that didn't bark. There's all sorts of people in the football community who have remained silent about this, and through their actions have made it clear they don't believe this story. So it wouldn't surprise me at all that Bill O'Brien
didn't he take over the Penn State mantle?
Yeah, and I'm sure at the beginning, he believed the whole thing because he had no idea. But I think this is my theory, but there was a football coach who got railroaded at Tennessee. He lost the Tennessee job because of his alleged involvement in this case, which was total crap. I mean, he had no involvement in this case at all. But Mike McQueary had mentioned him in one of his civil trial testimonies in a very self-serving way. And the way that the football community rallied around this football coach, who's now back at Rutgers, I believe, told me that the people in the football community don't really believe the story, because if they believed the story, this guy's career would have been completely over. And instead, the opposite transpired. So, and I think people like Urban Meyer, for instance, have shown through their actions, indirectly and directly. I think, by the way, Urban Meyer had when he was, I think last year when Penn State was playing Ohio State, he went to the Paterno house and had lunch with Sue Paterno and Franco Harris, a good friend of mine. I mean, those kinds of things wouldn't happen if there wasn't a feeling within the football community that they know this story is bullshit.
All right. Well, I'm going to end with just showing one of your web pages. Let's see. I just got to get my right page. Here we go. So here's, people want to follow up. There's the framing of Joe Paterno. People get a lot of your links through here. There's some videos up. I found some of the older ones, I guess. You have a mini movie and Franco Harris audio and whatnot. These are a little bit older. People can follow you on Twitter as well. There's John Ziegler. Sigmund Freud, funny. And I'm going to just also close with my own page here. If people want to help support my podcast, they can purchase my book, hopefully read it as well. It's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. I think we have something in common. We've both picked stories that have a narrative that people just accept as truth without having really looked into the underlying facts. My subtitle here is The Pandemic That Never Was. If people remember, there were mosquitoes in Brazil in 2015-16 and brought about supposedly Zika microcephaly, which is babies with small heads. Never came back again ever since. And nobody has in the science community, which is kind of got $1 billion sinecure now to study Zika, and in pursuit of currently a Zika vaccine, which no doubt will be mandated worldwide soon enough at very high profit margin for the makers, Moderna, Sanofi, Takeda. I don't think Pfizer's in this yet, but anyway. But the conspiracy, I'm not a conspiracist either, but it is kind of an odd thing. It at one point might very well bookend COVID with all of its vagaries in turning science upside down, vaccinating people after they've had illness and trotting out multiple vaccines and so forth. Anyway, so that's been an interesting pursuit for mine. I had no idea I would be, say a few years ago, before 2019, I had no idea that I would be the world's expert on debunking the Zika microcephaly pandemic. Very few people even think about it these days, but I'm having the book published in Brazil right now. I'm hoping they're going to care a little bit more than some of our U.S. audience. Anyway, thank you so much. Any thoughts before we leave?
Thanks for having an open mind, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You and I can chat for a second. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else.